This is Jason Leopold of Truthout.org. Recently I spoke with John McKay, the former U.S. Attorney for Western Washington State, who was fired last year along with 7 other U.S. attorneys for reasons that appear to be based entirely in partisan politics. John McKay, thanks for being with Truthout today. Bradley Schlotzman, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he had testified before Congress speaking about his work in the Justice Department. He had replaced one of the U.S. attorneys, Todd Graves, who was fired. What was your interaction with him? I believe he was involved with the Civil Rights Division. He admitted, actually, that he did take into account the political affiliations of some of the individuals that were hired. What was your interaction with him, if any, and did you have any insight into that?
Well, I believe many United States attorneys were concerned when Mr. Schlotzman was appointed United States Attorney in Kansas City.
Why is that?
Well, he was the deputy in the Civil Rights Division, but I don't think that he had the sort of background and experience that we would have expected to be United States Attorney. So I would say it would be true that many eyebrows were raised when he was first appointed. Of course, we didn't know that Todd Graves had been forced to resign. So now that we know that Todd Graves was forced to resign, and it appears that he was forced to resign at least in part because Mr. Schlotzman himself was trying to push the prosecution of voter fraud cases. I don't have all of the facts on this, and I understand they both testified today, and I haven't seen their testimony. But we are very troubled by the idea that a United States attorney who reviewed the evidence, who is a competent, capable person of integrity as Todd Graves is, and for Todd Graves to say, we don't have the evidence to proceed with this case. And then apparently Todd Graves is forced to resign, replaced by the very official who was attempting to pressure him.
To pursue voter fraud cases?
That person, Mr. Schlotzman, as I understand it, supervised the submittal of a number of cases to a federal grand jury in Kansas City, which in fact returned indictments shortly before the election in 2006. Now, I don't have all of the facts of that, and so I can't tell you, and I haven't heard their testimony, but just the basic outline of that is very disturbing to all of us, and my understanding is those cases that Mr. Schlotzman brought were dismissed by a United States District Judge. That is a very unusual circumstance, and you put all of those things together, and that is very troubling and I think very worthy of a full investigation.
In terms of Alberto Gonzales, you had mentioned that you believed he was not telling the truth.
Yes.
What do you believe he is hiding at this point?
Well, I think there's 2 really troubling aspects to his testimony. First, if you do take him at his word that he doesn't recall meetings that he attended or discussions about United States attorneys being fired, that's troubling in its own right, because anyone who's been around the Department of Justice or is familiar with how it works would be amazed that an Attorney General of the United States would allow 8 or 9 presidentially appointed United States attorneys to be dismissed without inquiring into the reasons for that is kind of absurd.
And in terms of Harriet Miers, I know that you recounted a conversation that you had when you had met with her. If you can elaborate just a bit on what took place.
Sure.
And what the time frame of that was.
Well, I had applied during the late spring and summer of 2006 to be a United States District Judge, to be a federal judge. A number of former United States attorneys have become judges, and I had hoped to become one. And so I had applied, and when I was not selected by a local committee, by Republicans on that committee, I felt that they were not treating me fairly because of the 2004 governor's election in Washington State. And so I asked for a meeting with Harriet Miers, whom I had known since work I'd been involved in the American Bar Association, and she immediately agreed to see me. I did meet with her on August 22nd, and with Harriet and her deputy, and their first question to me was, why would Republicans in the state of Washington be angry with you? A clear reference to the 2004 governor's election, where some believed that I should convene a grand jury and bring innocent people before the grand jury.
What was your response to her when she said that?
Well, I explained to both Harriet Miers and to Bill Kelly, her deputy, the background on the election. I pointed out to them, of course, that all of my actions as United States Attorney had been coordinated with the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., that in fact my office had filed written reports on the work we had done, and in my ultimate decision not to proceed with a full investigation. So as far as the department and the government was concerned, to my knowledge, nothing was controversial. It was very controversial in the state of Washington, and I felt that Ms. Myers and Mr. Kelly would understand that, and I presumed they would be aware of it.
Have you taken the time to sort of look at the evidence that exists right now? Do you think that you were being pressured to pursue bogus voter fraud cases?
Oh yes, in the state of Washington, Republican officials and others who were commenting on this very close election, 133 votes out of millions cast. And of course, when you get inside an election and look at what happened in the election, it's run by people and people make mistakes. And so there were a lot of very hard feelings on both sides. Later, a lawsuit filed in state court and a belief by some that the election had been stolen by the Democrats. And so there was a lot of talk radio and people calling my office and wanting to pick up my home and things like that, none of which bothered me as United States Attorney. That goes with the territory. I felt that my job was to look at the evidence. My job was to make sure that if the powers of the federal government, including an FBI investigation, were to be brought to bear, they should be made only on the guidelines that we have, which are to proceed on evidence.
Have you seen any documents or spoken to anyone behind the scenes who have perhaps provided you with some additional knowledge of what took place? Have you had any conversations with anyone in the Justice Department?
No, I have not. I have been shown some documents by the investigators and lawyers who were handling the investigation by the Inspector General and the Office of Professional Responsibility.
And what did those documents say, or what was in those documents?
I'd really rather not say. I think that's really up to the Inspector
Okay.
General to do. They may want to show those records
Sure.
to other people, and I don't want to get involved in their investigation. I respect their investigation very much.
Now, the knee-jerk reaction by some people will say, well, it's the Justice Department investigating the Justice Department.
Right.
How can that, how can the integrity of such an investigation, how could they follow through with it?
The Inspector General, which is not a well-known figure, they do hold quasi-independent status within the Justice Department. They are required to do their work independently of the Department of Justice, even though they live there, and they're required to report separately to the Congress, and that's critical. They do not report to the Attorney General. They report to the Congress of the United States any of their findings. So there will be an investigation and then a public report of what they find, and I have confidence in that.
Okay, and James Comey testified recently. He said that you may have gotten yourself into trouble, I'm paraphrasing here, for perhaps requesting some more resources. What was he speaking about, and what is the significance of asking the Department of Justice for additional resources? What was he speaking about?
Well, I was surprised by the question, which I believe came from Congressman Mel Watt to the former Deputy Attorney General Jim Comey. Jim is a tremendous public servant, and he's left the department now, but we all worked for Jim Comey. He was our boss, really, as Deputy Attorney General. And I think the question was about the assassination of Tom Wales, who was a federal prosecutor in Seattle, who many believe is the only federal prosecutor killed in the line of duty. His killer has not been apprehended. And I did speak out very strongly for resources to investigate Tom's murder. Tom was shot in the back while he wrote emails to his family at home one night.
And this was in 2001, I believe.
October 11th, 2001, Tom was murdered in his home. And, every federal prosecutor in the country is aware of the murder of Tom Wales. And of course, it's a major issue in Seattle, as it should be. And I believe that Tom, who was the colleague of all of the folks that I worked with, deserves, and his family deserves, all of the resources that the government can reasonably bring to bear to catch his killer. And so I spoke out on a number of occasions. And several times I had to speak out pretty forcefully to the department about making sure there were enough FBI agents and the appropriate prosecutors involved. But Jim Comey, of course, was as surprised as I was as I heard his testimony. Jim couldn't believe it either, because he felt as strongly as I did about catching the murder of Tom Wales.
He couldn't believe what? That they would not provide you with these additional resources, the Department of Justice?
No, I mean, you'd have to ask Mr. Comey, but I understood his response, and certainly my response was that for them to say I was fired over the assassination of Tom Wales is yet another
Right.
failed excuse by the department for whatever reason there was for my dismissal. And if they're using the assassination of Tom Wales to cover up some other reason, like the governor's election of 2004, then they have taken leave of any moral sense that they've ever had.
Right, well, let's just get into that just a bit. Do you believe, or is there any evidence to suggest that perhaps your investigation of his murder, was that thwarted by any means in terms of you're not receiving additional resources? What was the response when you did request these additional resources?
Well, in every turn we got them.
You did?
And yes, and resources were supplied. You know, I'm sure that the FBI, SAC, the agent in charge in Seattle, could have used more.
Right.
But to my satisfaction, the Department of Justice and the FBI responded appropriately. And in fact, I'm grateful to Bob Mueller for his support for that investigation. But you know, I had to rattle some cages to make sure that Tom's memory and the respect that we have for Tom Wales is vindicated in a full investigation. And I never received any indication from the Department of Justice that I had spoken out of turn or inappropriately. In fact, I know that's just utter hogwash. And that tells me that it's an excuse. See, they had to find an excuse for why I went on the list of March of 2005. The Attorney General testified to reasons that applied in September of 2006. And so now
Right.
they had to make up a reason, and the only thing apparently that Kyle Sampson could think of was the Wales investigation, and I just find that reprehensible.
Because he was murdered and you were trying to catch his,
Absolutely.
his killer.
Right, and I'd like to have anybody come in here and tell me that it wasn't appropriate for me to speak out about the murder of Tom Wales.
When you were asked to resign, what happened to some of the cases?
I think the real problem is where individuals in U.S. attorneys' offices are going to look at potential political corruption cases in the future. There's no question that what's happened now, this unprecedented firing of now 9 United States attorneys, will cause even career men and women to think twice about bringing a political corruption case, whether they have the evidence or not.
Is there a law or a suggestion, if you will, that states that pursuing voter fraud cases or evidence of voter fraud close to an election is off limits, or is there a suggestion that U.S. attorneys don't take action when it's so close to an election?
That's a very complex area, election law and
Okay.
federal election law. Essentially, elections are run by states, and the federal government's job is to make certain that no federal laws are violated. One of the important guidelines that are given to United States attorneys around the country at election time is don't take any steps that would make it look like you could impact a state election, and all elections are state elections. And so yes, you're right about that. We really are urged to stay away from elections unless we've learned that there is evidence that might be, that you might lose, or there is some other immediacy to a prosecution. What's troubling about the Kansas City situation, and again, I don't have all of the facts, but what I understand of the Kansas City situation is that voter fraud type cases were rushed to be filed before the election, and that's, of course, violates all of the advice that we're given in election fraud cases.
Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us.
Glad to do it, Jason. Thank you.
At this point, McKay does not have any intention to return to his former job inside the Justice Department. Recently, he was hired as general counsel for Getty Images in Seattle. In Beverly Hills, California, this is Jason Leopold reporting for Truthout.